Dakota Territory, 1880. While his neighbors raced to finish their log cabins before the first frost, Lars Halvorsen was still hammering in late September. Wind cut across the prairie, carrying the bite of winter, and smoke rose from every stone chimney except his. He was nailing 1,200 board feet of vertical pine planks over perfectly good logs, 1-inch by 12-inch boards running from foundation to eaves. His neighbors called it wasteful. Elias McCord, the man who'd helped raise half the cabins in the territory, laughed openly at the general store. "Fool's hiding sound timber like he's ashamed of it." But Halvorsen kept working, creating thousands of narrow air pockets between his round logs and flat boards, dead air space that would trap heat and stop the wind from finding every crack and joint. Then October 15th arrived without warning, 3 feet of snow in a single day. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero and stayed there. What would become known as the hard winter had begun. Standard chinked cabins froze families nearly to death. Ice formed on interior walls 3 feet from the fireplace. Children slept in coats while their parents burned furniture to stay alive. But that fool's cabin with the vertical boards? It stayed 15 to 18 degrees warmer than every other house in the settlement. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about wind, heat loss, and prairie survival that seasoned American builders had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The air inside Lars Halvorsen's cabin held steady at 48 degrees Fahrenheit on that January morning in 1881, while outside the mercury had dropped to 22 below zero. He checked the cheap thermometer tacked near his door, then quietly added a single stick of split oak to his cook stove. 300 yards away, in Elias McCord's cabin of identical size and similar construction, the family slept huddled in wool coats as frost feathers traced the interior chinking lines and a thin skin of ice formed over their water pail. The difference between the two homes wasn't the quality of their logs or the skill of their builders. It was 1,800 board feet of vertical pine planks that most folks in the territory had called the biggest waste of good lumber they'd ever seen. Lars had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1878 under the Homestead Act, claiming his 160-acre quarter section like thousands of other immigrants drawn by the promise of free land. But unlike most of his neighbors, he carried memories of Norwegian coastal winters where houses routinely endured temperatures well below zero, and families survived on careful rationing of firewood. In Trondheim province, where he'd grown up, every farmhouse showed the same practical wisdom: extra boarding over log walls, vertical strips of timber to break the wind, and stoves positioned to push heat through multiple rooms rather than straight up a chimney. Norwegian-American settlements across the upper Midwest had already proven these methods worked, with carefully placed stoves and additional wall layers that blocked the prairie wind's relentless assault on heating systems designed for calmer climates. After 2 brutal Dakota winters of constant rechinking, pushing fresh mud, clay, and straw into gaps that opened every time the logs shifted or the weather changed, Lars decided he was finished with patching joints every spring. The chinking between logs remained the weakest point of any frontier cabin, prone to cracking from freeze-thaw cycles and requiring annual repair work that cost both time and materials. Most homesteaders accepted this as the price of log construction, but Lars had seen enough Norwegian farmhouses where external boarding eliminated the endless cycle of gap filling and weather damage. In the summer of 1880, instead of simply rechinking his 18 by 22-foot cabin, Lars ordered sawn lumber from the mill in Yankton. Roughly 1,200 board feet of 1-inch by 12-inch pine planks, each 14 to 16 feet long. At 8 cents per board foot, the lumber cost him nearly $100, a substantial sum when most homesteaders lived on cash incomes of $300 to $500 per year. But he calculated that 2 seasons of reduced firewood needs would offset the initial expense, and the protected logs would last decades longer without replacement. The work began in late July. Rather than leave his logs bare to the weather, Lars nailed these planks vertically over the outside face of his horizontal log walls, creating what builders in more settled regions called board and batten construction. Each plank ran from just above his stone foundation to just under the eaves, overlapping both the sill log and the plate log. He secured every board with 16 penny cut nails at each log course, roughly 6 to 7 nails per board, nearly 900 nails total. The result was a continuous vertical surface that transformed his cabin's appearance from rustic frontier dwelling to something resembling a proper frame house. The critical difference lay in what happened between the round logs and the flat planks. Because logs are curved and boards are straight, the planks touch the logs only at their high points, floating over the low spots and creating thousands of narrow vertical air pockets. These cavities, often only a quarter inch to 3/4 of an inch wide, would prove to be the key to the entire system. Modern building science confirms that insulation works primarily by trapping air and reducing convection. The more small, confined air spaces, the higher the resistance to heat flow. Without knowing the technical terms, Lars had created a crude but effective double-wall system decades before engineers formalized the principles behind cavity insulation and thermal breaks. Neighbors gathering at Johansson's general store watched the progress with growing skepticism. Elias McCord, who had helped raise more log cabins than anyone else in the territory, measured building success in visible craftsmanship and construction speed. He could assess the quality of a cabin by examining the uniformity of the logs, the tightness of the corner joints, and the straightness of the ridgeline. To him, Lars was hiding perfectly good timber behind unnecessary boards, timber that represented both the builder's skill and the structure's inherent strength. "Man's building a barn over a house," McCord told anyone who would listen. "Must be nice to waste lumber when the rest of us are patching daubing." The other experienced builders nodded in agreement. They had learned their craft in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where good chinking and a substantial fire provided adequate warmth through winter months that rarely matched the sustained cold of Dakota Territory. Their traditional approach, 8 to 10-inch logs, heavy chinking with stones and clay, and cook stoves capable of burning 4 to 6 cords of wood per season, had served them well in milder climates. The criticism intensified when Lars added narrow battens over the worst vertical seams, creating true board and batten siding on his cabin's windward sides. This finishing touch eliminated even the hairline gaps between planks, but it also represented another $20 in lumber and several days of additional labor. To his neighbors, it appeared to be perfectionism carried to an absurd extreme. They pointed to their own cabins as evidence that traditional methods worked: chinked logs, perhaps whitewashed for appearance, maybe a covered porch for comfort, but no need to wrap a cabin like a Christmas package. Lars completed the work in early September, just as the first frost touched the prairie grass. His cabin now stood clothed in vertical planking from foundation to roof, the original logs completely hidden except where they showed at the gable ends. He had invested nearly 4 weeks of labor beyond what his neighbors considered necessary, purchased 2 extra wagon loads of lumber that others deemed wasteful, and created a structure that looked more like a townhouse than a frontier homestead. The local consensus held firm. He had overthought a simple problem and spent money that could have purchased livestock or farming equipment. But as autumn progressed toward what would become the most severe winter in Dakota Territory's recorded history, Lars remained quietly satisfied with his decision. He had built for the worst conditions he could imagine, not for the average prairie winter his neighbors expected. The vertical board stood ready to face whatever wind and cold the coming months would bring, and the thousands of trapped air pockets between logs and planks would soon prove their worth, in ways that conventional frontier wisdom could never have predicted. A typical Dakota Territory log cabin relied on walls 8 to 10 inches thick, built from softwood pine or fir logs that provided roughly 8 to 10 units of thermal resistance per wall. But this nominal insulation value assumed perfect conditions, tight joints, fresh chinking, and still air. The reality of frontier construction created a different performance profile entirely. Every 8 to 10 inches, horizontal log courses created continuous joints that required filling with chinking materials: stones, split wood, moss, clay mixed with lime, and often horse or cattle manure for binding. These joints, even when freshly packed, represented thermal weak points that conducted heat directly from interior to exterior air. The chinking itself proved vulnerable to Dakota's extreme weather cycles. Repeated freezing and thawing caused clay-based materials to crack and shrink, while log movement from moisture changes opened gaps that required constant maintenance. Winter winds exceeding 30 miles per hour transformed even hairline cracks into air ducts, allowing heated interior air to escape while drawing cold exterior air into living spaces. Under these conditions, the effective insulation value of a log wall could drop to half its theoretical rating, turning a cabin into a structure that fought against itself rather than protecting its inhabitants. Lars understood this fundamental weakness from his Norwegian experience, where coastal buildings faced similar challenges from wind-driven moisture and temperature extremes. The solution his countrymen had developed was elegantly simple: create a second skin that bore the brunt of weather assault while protecting the structural wall behind it. His vertical planking system worked on the same principle, but adapted to log construction rather than the timber frame methods common in Scandinavia. The construction sequence he followed had been refined through generations of Nordic building practice. First, he checked and patched his existing chinking one final time, ensuring that the log wall itself was as tight as traditional methods could make it. Then he snapped vertical chalk lines 16 inches on center across all four walls, marking the attachment points for his external sheathing. Where log surfaces varied significantly from plumb, he added thin furring strips, rough sawn 1 by 2 inch pieces, to create consistent attachment points and ensure the finished planks would hang straight and true. The vertical installation of 12-inch planks required careful planning and substantial physical effort. Each board, weighing roughly 40 pounds and stretching 14 to 16 feet in length, had to be positioned precisely and secured at every log course. Lars used 16-penny cut nails, driven deep enough to penetrate the log surface, but not so deep as to split the plank face. The nailing pattern: 6 to 7 attachment, points per board, distributed structural loads while allowing for the seasonal movement that affected all wood construction in extreme climates. The genius of the system emerged from the inevitable mismatch between curved logs and flat planks. No amount of careful fitting could make straight boards conform perfectly to round log surfaces, and Lars made no attempt to force this impossible union. Instead, he allowed the natural gaps to remain, creating an intricate network of vertical air channels that ran from foundation to eaves. These spaces varied from 1/4 inch at contact points to 3/4 of an inch, where logs curved away from planks, forming thousands of small chambers that would trap air and resist heat movement through convection. Modern building scientists recognize this trapped air principle as fundamental to all insulation systems. Air itself provides excellent thermal resistance when prevented from moving, but moving air carries heat rapidly from warm to cold surfaces through convection currents. By creating numerous small, confined airspaces, Lars had unknowingly replicated the mechanism that makes modern fiberglass and foam insulation effective. The vertical orientation of his air channels further enhanced performance by reducing convection within the cavities themselves. The finishing details revealed Lars's attention to long-term performance rather than immediate appearance. He held the bottom edge of each plank 4 to 6 inches above ground level, preventing soil contact that would encourage rot and insect damage. This detail, standard practice in Norwegian construction, reflected an understanding that wood preservation required constant attention to moisture management. Similarly, his decision to add narrow battens over vertical joints on the cabin's windward sides eliminated the last paths for air infiltration, creating a nearly continuous barrier against wind-driven heat loss. The performance difference between his double skin system and conventional log construction became measurable even before winter's full arrival. During September's first cold snap, with outside temperatures dropping to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, Lars recorded interior temperatures that remained 10 to 12 degrees warmer than similar cabins. More significantly, his cabin cooled much more slowly when fires died down, losing only 5 to 6 degrees over 3 hours compared to the 10 to 12 degree drops his neighbors experienced. These early measurements reflected the system's primary advantage: dramatically reduced air infiltration. While his neighbors fought constant battles against drafts that entered through shifting chinking, Lars's external planking created a continuous air barrier that deflected wind before it could reach the log joints. The trapped air spaces added modest insulation value, perhaps 1 to 2 additional units of thermal resistance, But their real contribution lay in eliminating the wind-washing effect that pumped heat out of conventional log walls during storms. Elias McCord and the other experienced builders continued to dismiss these early indicators as coincidence or measurement error. They trusted methods proven over decades of frontier construction, substantial fires, abundant firewood, and heavy chinking renewed each spring. Their skepticism reflected genuine experience. In milder climates and less exposed locations, traditional log construction had indeed provided adequate shelter for generations of American families. They could not yet imagine conditions severe enough to overwhelm these time-tested approaches. But as October progressed and the first serious weather systems moved across the northern plains, subtle signs began accumulating that would soon transform skepticism into desperate need. The vertical boards stood ready to face their ultimate test, and the thousands of air pockets between logs and planks would soon prove whether Norwegian coastal wisdom could survive the worst winter Dakota Territory had ever recorded. The blizzard struck Dakota Territory on October 15, 1880, with a ferocity that caught even experienced plains dwellers unprepared. What began as scattered snow flurries at dawn had transformed by afternoon into a howling wall of white that reduced visibility to mere feet and drove temperatures from a comfortable 50 degrees down to 15 below zero in less than 12 hours. This sudden savage storm marked the beginning of what meteorologists would later document as the hard winter or long winter, 7 months of unprecedented cold and snow that would test every structure, every heating system, and every survival strategy across the northern Great Plains. The storm's intensity surprised settlers who had grown accustomed to the gradual seasonal transitions typical of their former homes in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the eastern Midwest. Prairie weather followed different rules, with Arctic air masses sweeping unobstructed across hundreds of miles of flat grassland, gathering momentum and moisture before colliding with warmer systems to create meteorological violence unknown in forested or mountainous regions. Wind speeds during this first blizzard reached sustained velocities of 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60, forces capable of driving snow through the smallest gaps in even well-constructed buildings. Families across the territory found themselves trapped in their cabins for 3 days straight as snow accumulated to depths of 3 feet or more. The combination of extreme cold and relentless wind created conditions that exposed every weakness in frontier construction methods. Chinking that had seemed adequate during mild autumn weather began failing almost immediately as temperature differentials between interior and exterior air reached 60 to 70 degrees. Clay-based materials contracted and cracked, while organic components like moss and grass froze solid and lost their flexibility, creating pathways for wind-driven air that transformed cabins into wind tunnels rather than shelters. During this first extended test, neighbors began noticing differences that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or measurement error. Mrs. Eleanor Johansson, visiting the McCord cabin to check on their youngest child who had developed a persistent cough, found the family huddled around their cook stove in wool coats and blankets, despite a fire that consumed nearly a full cord of wood over 2 days. Frost patterns traced the interior chinking lines in delicate but ominous detail, and the water bucket near their door showed a skin of ice thick enough to require breaking with a knife handle each morning. By contrast, when she stopped at the Halverson place to borrow medical supplies, she found Lars working at his kitchen table in his shirt sleeves, making repairs to a harness by the light of a single oil lamp. The interior air felt warm enough that she removed her heavy coat within minutes of entering, and she noticed no frost formations on any interior surfaces despite the identical storm raging outside. The difference was so pronounced that she mentioned it to her husband that evening, wondering aloud whether the Halverson cabin might be positioned in some naturally protected location that deflected the worst of the wind. Lars had begun keeping detailed records in a small notebook, partly from Norwegian habit and partly from genuine curiosity about his building experiment's performance. During the October blizzard, with outside temperatures holding steady at 18 below zero and wind speeds that made accurate measurement impossible, his interior temperatures remained between 45 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit. More significantly, when he allowed his fire to die down to coals overnight, a risky practice his neighbors would never attempt during such weather. The cabin lost only 6 to 8 degrees over 8 hours. Traditional log cabins under similar conditions typically dropped 15 to 20 degrees during the same period, forcing families to maintain constant fires that consumed enormous quantities of firewood and created their own hazards from overheated stoves and chimneys. The explanation for this dramatic performance difference lay in the fundamental physics of heat transfer, though Lars understood it in practical rather than scientific terms. His vertical planking system had created what modern engineers would recognize as a pressure-equalized cavity wall, a design that uses an exterior air barrier to prevent wind from directly impacting the structural wall behind it. The thousands of small air pockets between logs and planks absorbed and dissipated wind pressure, preventing the pumping action that drove heated air out of conventional log construction during storms. Additionally, the continuous exterior sheathing eliminated thermal bridging, the direct conduction of heat through solid materials that connected interior and exterior environments. In traditional log walls, every log end, every chinking joint, and every structural connection provided a pathway for heat to travel directly from warm interior air to cold exterior surfaces. Lars's planking interrupted these pathways, forcing heat to travel through multiple air spaces where convection was limited by the narrow dimensions of the cavities themselves. Red Elk, a Lakota hunter who occasionally traded at Johansson's store, observed the October storm from a sheltered position in the timber along the creek bottom. His people had long understood that prairie wind carried the real danger of winter weather, not the cold itself, but the moving air that stripped heat from bodies and shelters with relentless efficiency. Traditional Lakota winter camps were always positioned to break prevailing winds, with lodge arrangements and landscape features used to create dead air spaces where fires could work effectively. When he saw how the white settlers' cabins performed during the blizzard, some smoking heavily as their occupants burned furniture and wagon parts to stay warm, while others like the Norwegian's place showed only thin wisps from efficient fires, he recognized the same principle at work in different materials. The storm finally broke on October 18th, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snowdrifts that reached the eaves of some buildings and buried fence lines completely. As families emerged to assess damage and check on neighbors, the evidence of structural performance was impossible to ignore. Several cabins showed obvious chinking failures, with gaps wide enough to insert a finger where clay and moss had contracted away from log surfaces. The Anderson place, built just 2 years earlier with what everyone had considered exemplary craftsmanship, revealed interior frost damage to stored vegetables and grain, clear evidence that interior temperatures had dropped well below freezing despite continuous fires. But perhaps most telling was the simple measurement of firewood consumption. Over the 3-day period, families in standard log cabins had burned through quantities of wood that would normally last a full week, while Lars had used approximately half that amount to maintain superior comfort levels. This difference represented more than mere efficiency. It suggested a fundamental advantage that could prove crucial during the long winter months ahead, when every stick of firewood might mean the difference between survival and disaster. By December of 1880, the pattern of relentless storms had established itself across Dakota Territory with a regularity that defied all previous frontier experience. Weather records from Omaha and other regional stations would later document November 1880 as the coldest November on record, with many days never rising above freezing and frequent snow events that added layers rather than melting between storms. The accumulated snowfall through the territory reached depths that older settlers claimed exceeded anything in their collective memory, with drifts that engulfed buildings and transformed familiar landscapes into alien white expanses where landmarks disappeared beneath uniform blankets of wind-sculpted snow. The railroad lines that connected prairie settlements to eastern markets and supply centers had ceased operation by early December. Snow removal equipment of the era proved inadequate against accumulations measured in feet rather than inches, and repeated storms buried the tracks faster than crews could clear them. Grain shipments stopped moving, coal deliveries ended, and the flow of manufactured goods that frontier communities depended upon ground to a complete halt. Families found themselves isolated, not just from distant cities, but from neighboring settlements that lay only miles away across impassable drifts. In the McCord cabin, the daily struggle for warmth had become a consuming occupation that left little energy for other activities. Elias spent his mornings splitting and carrying firewood, his afternoons feeding an increasingly hungry cook stove, and his evenings huddled with his family around the failing heat that barely reached the cabin's corners. The chinking he had renewed in September showed gaps wide enough to slide a knife blade through, and repeated attempts to patch these openings with fresh clay had failed as each new mixture froze before it could properly set. Ice formed on the interior walls within 3 feet of the fireplace on the coldest nights, creating a visible reminder that his traditional methods were losing the battle against unprecedented conditions. The firewood consumption had reached alarming levels across the settlement. Families who had laid in what they considered generous supplies, 10 to 12 cords per household, were burning through a full cord every 10 to 14 days during the most severe cold snaps. At this rate, even well-prepared homesteads would exhaust their fuel supplies before spring, forcing desperate measures that included burning furniture, fence posts, and even structural timbers from barns and outbuildings. The McCord family had already sacrificed 2 wooden chairs and a table to their cook stove, and Elias had begun eyeing the interior partition walls with the grim calculation of a man measuring his remaining options. Children throughout the territory developed deep, persistent coughs from breathing air that alternated between overheated near the stoves and frigid in the corners where families slept. The constant temperature variations, combined with air so dry it cracked lips and hands, created respiratory conditions that frontier medicine was ill-equipped to address. Some families moved their beds into the kitchen areas, sleeping on floors near their cook stoves in defiance of fire safety practices they had followed for decades. Others hung quilts and blankets against exterior walls, creating fabric barriers that provided psychological comfort but little actual insulation against the relentless cold that penetrated through failing, chinking, and structural joints. Meanwhile, Lars maintained his methodical documentation of conditions inside his planked cabin. During a particularly severe stretch in mid-January, when exterior temperatures held below -15 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 consecutive days, his interior remained stable between 46 and 53 degrees. More remarkably, he was burning wood at a rate that would consume only 7 to 8 cords over the entire winter season, roughly 2/3 the fuel consumption of his neighbors under identical weather conditions. The vertical planking continued to perform its invisible work, creating a barrier system that prevented wind from reaching the log joints where traditional cabins bled heat with every gust. The physical evidence of this performance difference became impossible for neighbors to ignore. During the worst storms, when wind speeds exceeded 40 miles per hour and drove snow horizontally across the prairie, visitors to the Halverson cabin could feel the temperature difference within seconds of entering. The interior walls remained dry and frost-free, water buckets showed no ice formation, and stored vegetables and preserves showed no signs of freeze damage despite being kept in unheated storage areas that would have frozen solid in conventional construction. On the night of January 24th, with yet another blizzard howling across the territory and temperatures dropping toward 25 below zero, a knock came at Lars's door. Elias McCord stood in the swirling snow with his youngest son bundled in his arms, both of them shivering despite heavy coats and wool scarves. The child had developed a fever that McCord feared would prove fatal in the bitter conditions of his own cabin, where interior temperatures had dropped below freezing despite a fire that consumed their remaining furniture and threatened to overheat the chimney. Lars opened his door without hesitation, stepping aside to allow the McCord family into the warmth of his vertical planked sanctuary. Within minutes, they had removed their heavy coats, and the child's fever-flushed face began to return to normal coloration in air, warm enough to breathe comfortably. They slept on blankets spread near Lars's efficiently operating stove, surrounded by walls that held heat instead of bleeding it away to the merciless wind outside. The next morning brought clear skies and still air that allowed accurate temperature measurements. The exterior thermometer read -22 degrees Fahrenheit, while Lars's interior maintained a steady 49 degrees, a temperature differential of 71 degrees achieved through construction techniques that his neighbors had mocked just months earlier. McCord examined the interior walls with the eye of an experienced builder, running his hands along surfaces that showed no frost formation, no ice crystals, no evidence of the thermal failure that plagued every other cabin in the territory. For the first time since the vertical planking project had begun, McCord asked detailed questions about board dimensions, nail spacing, and attachment methods. He studied the way the planks overlapped the foundation and eaves, noted how the battens sealed vertical joints against air infiltration, and calculated the board footage required to sheath his own cabin. The mockery and dismissal that had characterized his previous comments were replaced by the focused attention of a craftsman recognizing superior technique when survival itself provided the final examination of building methods. The transformation from critic to student occurred without dramatic speeches or public acknowledgments of error. Instead, McCord simply began planning modifications to his own cabin that would incorporate the lessons being demonstrated around him every hour of every day. The vertical planks had passed their ultimate test, proving their worth not through theoretical arguments, but through the fundamental measure of frontier life. They kept families alive when traditional wisdom failed. The spring thaw of 1881 arrived with the sudden violence typical of prairie weather, transforming 7 months of accumulated snow into torrents of muddy water that overwhelmed creek beds and turned every low-lying area into temporary lakes. The runoff from the hard winter created flooding conditions throughout the Missouri and Mississippi river systems, adding a final hardship to communities already devastated by the longest, coldest winter in recorded frontier history. As the floodwaters receded and families emerged to assess the damage, the physical evidence of structural performance told a story that no amount of theoretical argument could refute. Elias McCord's cabin showed the characteristic wounds of a building that had fought and lost a season-long battle against extreme weather. The chinking between logs had failed catastrophically, with gaps wide enough to insert a man's fist where clay and organic materials had contracted, cracked, and fallen away. The windward wall displayed dozens of linear feet of joints that required complete replacement, and several logs showed the beginning signs of weather damage, bark lifting, surface checking, and the gray discoloration that preceded rot in exposed timber. The interior walls bore frost stains and watermarks where ice had formed and melted repeatedly throughout the winter, leaving behind mineral deposits and mold growth that would require extensive cleaning and repair. By contrast, Lars's planked cabin emerged from the same winter showing remarkably little wear. The vertical sheathing had absorbed the punishment of wind-driven snow and ice, protecting the logs beneath from direct weather exposure. When he removed a few boards to inspect the condition of the original chinking, he found joints that remained tight and intact, with clay materials that showed minimal cracking despite 7 months of temperature extremes. The logs themselves retained their structural integrity and showed none of the surface weathering that marked every other building in the settlement. Most significantly, the interior walls required only routine cleaning, no frost damage, no ice staining, no evidence of the thermal stress that had marked less protected structures. The economic implications of this performance difference extended far beyond immediate repair costs. McCord calculated that he would need to purchase several hundred pounds of clay, lime, and other chinking materials just to restore his cabin to minimal winter readiness. The labor involved in stripping and replacing failed chinking represented weeks of work that could otherwise be devoted to farming, livestock care, or other productive activities. More troubling was the evidence of log deterioration that suggested his cabin's structural lifespan had been significantly shortened by a single season of extreme weather exposure. Word of these contrasts spread through the territory's informal communication networks, with the speed typical of frontier communities where survival information carried premium value. At church socials and community gatherings, conversations that had once centered on crop prices and livestock breeding now focused intensively on construction techniques and thermal performance. Men who had dismissed the vertical planking project as wasteful excess began asking detailed questions about board dimensions, attachment methods, and total material costs. Thomas Avery, a second-wave homesteader who had purchased a relinquished claim in the spring of 1881, made his building plans based entirely on observed performance rather than traditional practice. After examining both the McCord and Halverson cabins and interviewing their occupants about fuel consumption, interior comfort, and maintenance requirements, He ordered lumber for vertical sheathing before he even began cutting logs for his walls. His practical calculation was straightforward. The additional cost of boards and nails represented a small fraction of the potential savings in firewood, chinking materials, and structural repairs over the building's expected lifespan. The construction season of 1881 witnessed a fundamental shift in local building practices as multiple families adopted variations of Lars's double-wall approach. The Anderson brothers, who had lost significant portions of their cabin's chinking during the hard winter, ordered 1,200 board feet of 1-inch by 10-inch pine planks and spent late summer sheathing their entire structure. They experimented with narrow battens over vertical joints, creating a true board and batten exterior that eliminated even hairline air infiltration paths. Their installation followed Lars's methods closely: vertical orientation, attachment at every log course, and careful attention to foundation and eave details that protected both sheathing and underlying logs from moisture damage. Johann Müller, a German immigrant whose background in European timber construction made him receptive to multi-layer building approaches, developed a variation that used horizontal sheathing boards applied over the vertical log structure. His system created similar dead air spaces between structural and weather-bearing elements, while offering different aesthetic and installation characteristics. The horizontal boards required more complex cutting and fitting around door and window openings, but they provided excellent protection against wind-driven precipitation and created an exterior appearance that resembled conventional clapboard siding. Sarah Boyle, the territorial schoolteacher whose detailed diary provided contemporary documentation of the community's transformation, recorded specific measurements and observations that would later prove invaluable to historians studying frontier building evolution. Her winter 1881 entries noted interior temperature differences of 15 to 20 degrees between sheathed and unsheathed cabins under identical exterior conditions. She documented fuel consumption variations that showed planked buildings using 30 to 40% less firewood than conventional log construction, and she tracked the spread of the sheathing technique through her community with the precision of a scientific observer. By 1885, the visual character of the settlement had changed dramatically. Where once every structure had displayed the horizontal lines of exposed log construction, now most buildings wore vertical or horizontal sheathing that gave them the appearance of frame houses rather than frontier cabins. To casual observers, the community seemed to have undergone rapid urbanization, but the transformation actually represented the systematic application of improved thermal performance techniques that preserved the essential log structure while dramatically enhancing its ability to provide comfortable shelter. The long-term implications of this building evolution extended well beyond individual comfort and fuel economy. Structures that had been sheathed during the early 1880s remained habitable and structurally sound decades later, while unprotected log buildings from the same era showed accelerated deterioration that often required complete replacement within 15 to 20 years. The vertical planking system that had been mocked as wasteful excess had proven itself as a preservation technique that extended building life cycles while reducing annual maintenance requirements, a combination that represented genuine economic advantage in the resource-constrained environment of frontier settlement. Modern building science would eventually formalize the principles that Lars had discovered through practical experimentation: continuous air barriers, thermal breaks, and cavity insulation systems that formed the foundation of energy-efficient construction. But on the Dakota prairie of the 1880s, these concepts needed no theoretical validation. They had already passed the ultimate test of keeping families warm when the wind came looking for a way in.